Now you can start.
Today's March 18th, 2020, and this is our reading of SIG Auth. Looks like the first thing on our agenda is a demo. Jim, do you want to kick us off? Jim.
So I pinged him on Slack, but I don't think he's on the call.
All right. That's okay. We can come back to it if he responds. I presume that these next two items are the same Jim.
Yep.
Okay. All right, then the next item on our list is Rita's item. Is on the call.
Yeah, I don't think she's on the call. I'll reach out to her and see.
This is great. This is great. All right. I had pushed myself to the bottom in an attempt to give other people the floor in the meeting. I can see. Does anyone else have something they want to discuss before Mo's like 5 items?
Mo, carry the team.
Say again?
You got to carry a team. Let's lead.
Okay.
Your support for basic auth.
Yes. Does anyone care if we delete basic auth support? Does anyone have reservations or concerns about removing this functionality that is awful and we should never have it?
So the history here is that during the security audit, we found the security auditors found a non-constant time password comparison. We fixed that, and at the same time, we also decided to deprecate basic auth. That was in 1.16. So we are okay to remove it, but we are not obliged to remove it this release cycle. If nobody has an opinion on it, I'd say let's just go for it, because we made it out of the deprecation window.
If what are the odds that somebody is using it?
Kube control, does it actually bark at you and tell you that it's deprecated?
That is a good point. I do not think that kube control would do that.
Okay. What other contexts would you, like that? Mine was the same question, but a little bit broader. Is like, could someone be depending on this and not know it's deprecated? Kube control is an obvious one. Is there any other angle we'd have to consider? Like, could a significant production user legitimately not know that this was deprecated and be dependent on it?
The API server tells you if you start it, like if you give it a basic CSV file, it tells you, but it's very conceivable that could be lost in the flood of logs.
When was the deprecation? 1.16?
Yeah.
And we announced it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the value of this authenticator is primarily for browsers accessing the Kubernetes API server, which is probably not it's responsible for giving you that pop-up window to enter a username and password.
I feel like Jordan and I fought this being introduced, in which case I think like someone put it in and we didn't stop them in time or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of it going away. If we have reached out to sort of the major deployers that we're aware of, I know like the cluster API stuff and kubeadm stuff have never used this. If we kind of reach out to the major deployments that we're aware of and do a sweep, and no one is saying this is super important and we're using this heavily, then I'm in favor of removing it. This does tie into something that I'm wanting to work on in 119, which is a way to surface messages to users who are using deprecated things. So I will reference this as a place I would have liked to be able to send messages to users using this authentication mechanism to say, hey, this is deprecated and it's going away in 119.
It's like Clippy is going to come out of kube control or something.
It looks like you're trying to authenticate with basic auth.
All right, so for whoever is to reestimate deployers and also do sweep to check for usage. Is reasonable?
And this was a non-optional flag, so your API server is not even going to start when you try to put 119 on, right?
If you are currently using basic auth and you upgrade to a version that does not have it, yeah, it'll say, I don't know this flag anymore.
It's better than a lot of the other things we've deprecated.
This is just my lack of understanding. Is this possibly used in any like of our like testing frameworks or like end-to-end tests or anything?
No.
And if it was, it should make CI go red if the test is like actually running.
Yeah. All the places I'm aware of were using that needed a static authentication mechanism. We're using the token file, which is similarly problematic, but at least it doesn't have the www authenticate, make your browser remember your credentials forever problem.
Also, people shouldn't be together from a browser, in my personal opinion. All right, did you get your answer, Mo?
Yes, I get the general feeling that it's okay to kill it with some extra little, make sure that I can try at least search GitHub and stuff and try to figure out who may be using this and if that is a concern.
Should we jump to the demo now that we have Jim?
Yeah, let's just pretend that we're starting over.
Jim, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you. And apologies for running late. Was trying to get off another call. I know I had a few things on the agenda. One of the, and I'd listed doing a quick demo of Kubernetes, so happy to do that. But also wanted to see if we could talk about, we had, last time we had a few items on the agenda that we weren't able to go to. So one of those was this, the multi-tenancy benchmarks, and then it was also this request for the new Git repo for the policy working group. So just for time management, I'm not sure if there's any preferred sequence we want to go through. Happy to just do a quick overview of Kubernetes and show what the tool does. But then I do want, if we can, I guess some of the priorities from at least my perspective would be to make sure we have some time to discuss the multi-tenancy benchmarks.
We like demos. I would like to see a demo.
Okay.
We can get to the meat of the discussion.
All right, so let me start with that, right, and just introduce Kubernetes very briefly, and then I'll switch to the command line and kind of show how some of this would work through the repo itself. So and some of you may already be familiar with this, but what Kubernetes does is it's just like OPA Gatekeeper, it's a policy management tool. It's designed more just for Kubernetes, so it's not a general purpose policy management tool. And the main difference here, and the reason why we introduced Kubernetes is for, we didn't want to have a separate language or a separate way of defining and managing policies, but wanted to keep things as Kubernetes, as close to Kubernetes constructs and best practices as possible, right? So really the intent, is make it easy for cluster operators to create policies And then also be able to support, in addition to validation of, of certain constructs, support mutate and generate. And we're just adding a feature where we're going to be able to not just generate resources on triggers, but also keep resources synchronized. So for use cases where you have multiple namespaces, and I saw something on Twitter just yesterday, I think, where there was a proposal on keeping namespaces even synchronized across multiple clusters. But what this would do is, if you have use cases where you want to keep things like role bindings or secrets, synchronized across different namespaces in the same cluster, you'd be able to do that. And because of the way Kyverno is designed, like it will work with pretty much any resource, and you can, even write policies to generate policies and create customizations if required. So the basic idea, again, similar to other admission controllers. I mean, you get, the Kyverno engine will sit behind the admission controller. It will receive requests from the API server and will be able to then validate resources, send those back as responses to the API server, or in cases where if it's just a validate rule, it would be able to then generate violations. So that's a CR. And be able to then generate also events on both the resource itself as well as the, you'll see those on the policy if anything is violated. So the structure of a policy looks something like this. One single policy can have several rules. Rules can have match or exclude blocks.
Sorry, is it just, are you presenting right now?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, can you not?
Yeah, okay. I thought you were doing the intro, but you started talking about.
I don't see anything though.
Oh, my apologies. I'm not. Let me get back to. Sorry, I thought I started my screen share, but no. Yeah, so I did have these slides up, and I was just kind of actually talking through the structure. Yeah, so this is what I was just describing as the basics of how Kyverno works, right? So it's fairly straightforward as a admission controller, and then the policy engine itself. We also have a CLI where it would then be able to do some of the same functions, but outside of a cluster if you want to test policies and things like that, right? So the structure of a policy looks something like this. You have policies with rules, you have match and exclude blocks. You can match and exclude based on kinds, names, selectors, label selectors, namespaces, and also we've added user roles, groups, names. So you can control in a fairly fine-grained manner what type of resources you want to match the policy on or exclude. And then each rule will have either a mutate, a validate, and a generate construct. And diving into a little bit more about, so this is just an example of the match and exclude. So we're showing a match, and it uses label selectors to match, on application, and then kinds over here you can specify. Or you can leave that empty, so that would match all kinds with label. That in most cases, then the policy is only operating on metadata. But if you leave kinds empty, but if you specify particular kinds, then of course you could have more detailed YAML constructs or policy constructs for different definitions. So here's an example of a mutate, which is using a JSON patch. So we support two styles of mutate. One is a JSON patch, and one is more of an overlay type of syntax. So in a patch, of course, here we can do different operations like add, delete, modify. But there's also some additional, decorations you can put onto the YAMLs. Like for example, the first one will do like an if then else type of construct. And so this is something we call an anchor in the YAML, which putting the parentheses will add the conditional logic. And then otherwise you could do an if not defined and only mutate the YAML if something's not defined in the second example, right? So those are, that's an example of using some simple logic within the policy YAML itself. A validate is also pretty straightforward, right? So here, this simple example is showing that we require, if you want to require a label, which is an app label, then you would write a policy in this manner, and you write a validate rule. Other operators, in addition to these wildcards, other operators that you can use would be like, arithmetic type operators for numbers, and then like not and or type operators for other logical conditions. So the third type of rule, which would be a generate policy, right? So this would be where you can generate, for example, if a new namespace is created, that's the most common use case. Some of the users in the community are now using also to generate role bindings when a CR is created, things like that. So it could be on any generate trigger. But if you want to kind of add a network policy, and this is what's shown when a namespace is created, you could put that data directly in the generate, or we have an option to point to some other resource and pull that configuration. So there's several more features, but let me switch to actually just showing this live, and I want to test and make sure. So let me check if I already have Kubernetes running, and if we do, what we can, oops, I was on another context. So I'm going to go back to my local cluster. Okay, so it doesn't look like I have Kubernetes installed here. Good. So then what I'm going to do is just go ahead and install Kubernetes, and then we'll go through just a quick example of how this works. Any questions or thoughts so far while I'm pulling that up?
How would you say this project is similar and or different from OPA Gatekeeper?
Right. Yeah, so the main difference, like I was mentioning, is just the language for policies, right? So OPA, of course, uses Rego as its underlying language. Gatekeeper adds some constraints definitions on top of the Rego, but ultimately requires still, creating and managing policies or the Rego syntax as well. So that's the main difference. Some of the other differences, which I think, if I recall correctly, there was either a roadmap item or perhaps it's already supported, like in terms of the generate rule. So that was something new that we introduced in this project. And then I believe I did see that there was some plans to introduce that into Gatekeeper as well. So yeah, and the mutate, of course, I believe that you could also do that through Rego, but we support natively the validate, the mutate, and generate. But the syntax and writing policies, managing policies is what we make very straightforward. And then all of the results, the policies themselves are CRs, as well as, of course, the policy violations would become also custom resources in your cluster itself. So one effort that we are kind of discussing in the policy work group is so there's OPA Gatekeeper, there's tools like Falco, there's other tools like K-Rails, there's Kyverno. So we see that there'll be multiple ways of doing policies, right? But to try and standardize some of the machinery around policies, one of the proposals we had was the policy CR. And I'll show what that looks like in Kyverno, but the idea would be that independently of how you've created the policies, at least there would be some commonality to how those could be reported. But to get started, let me go ahead and just install Kubernetes, right? And I'm just gonna use the basic syntax on my command line. Okay, so if I do get namespace now, I should see Kubernetes is created as a namespace, and whoops. Yeah, and let's just check the logs. So I don't know why my there we go. Okay, so everything looks good, and I see that my Kubernetes is now running inside my cluster, and it automatically also registered with the API server to start receiving webhooks. So at this point, I shouldn't have any policies. So if I say get cluster policies, it will show me there's nothing installed. So, but what we can do is install some best practice policies from our repo itself, right? So let me go back to the repo, and I'll show something that we have here. If you scroll down, so there's some samples of some of the things we covered, but let me go to the sample policies. So here, we have a number of different policies. Like, this is of course a good example of disallowing root user. So if I take that policy, the way it's written and the way to read through it is saying pretty much match on pod, but then it's going to, it's checking for both the security context at the pod level and then at each container level, and making sure that it's set to true, right? And that's what we want to validate. So let's just take this.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
So I noticed that you're not checking init containers in this policy. Does containers, is there any special logic to say that containers applies to all containers, or would you need a separate field to check init containers as well?
Right. So you would just add another pattern to this any pattern block, and you would write for init containers and then add the same check over there. But that's a good point, and we'll update the example to include that. One thing you could also do is you can reference, in Kubernetes, you can reference other parts of the policy. So if you don't want to write, like if this becomes too long, here it's only a couple of lines, but if it were a longer block, you could just, write it once and then include it in several portions of your YAML. So, but let me go ahead and grab this, and we'll create a simple policy, and we'll show what this looks like, right? So I'll just do.
While you're doing that, does validate in this context mean like if you fail this validation, the object is rejected?
So validate would mean that it creates a policy violation and reports that. But there's two modes, right? So the default is to report the policy violation, but you could also enable a mode to enforce it, in which case it would reject it completely, right? So, and so actually I have that policy here, so I'll just open it up and see what that's doing, and then we'll go ahead and import it back in. Yeah, so this is where, like, so here we're doing the match, and then basically we're running that same policy that we saw, and we're, applying it to both of these. So let me just go ahead and import that, and then we'll see what that looks like. And I'm gonna also then switch, the mode we will show, where instead of just doing the validate and reporting the violation, we can also just block the request completely. Okay, so let's add that policy in. And so if I now do get cluster policies, I'll see that one policy. If I do policy violations, I shouldn't see anything yet because actually it automatically started picking up already some violations. So I'm seeing all the pods now in my, in my cluster, which are showing up. So it looks like I had some like guest book or something running before. So it's showing that those are violating, right? And if I look at, one of those, so let's go ahead and check more details. It will show me, which resource, obviously, which policy, which resource, and more information on, and of course, if I change the resource or if I change the policy, this will automatically recalculate at that point. So, but let's go ahead and, what we'll do is we can also, instead of showing this as, I'll go back to my, so all of the samples by default, I just configured to show the violations. But what I could also do, if we go back to the docs, and I'll just quickly show the different validate modes. We can change one of these policies to be able to, block the request as well on admission control, right? So that's what this validate failure action does. And if I go into my policy and let's just add this validate failure action. And we'll change this to enforce. And so if you have it as audit, by default, what that will do is it will create the violations. If I make this enforce, and let's re-import that policy. So of course, for existing rules, existing resources, it will still go ahead and just be able to, it will still create violations. But now if I run, let's say, I believe I have some YAMLs here. So if I just look at maybe, okay, that should be fine. So what we'll do is we'll just say create NSF, and I think I have, okay, so we'll try this one. Oops, so it looks like it did not take that change. So what should have happened, what I was expecting is it would show, it would block the request itself, which is what it's supposed to do, but it seems like, yeah, it's still validate failure action audit. So did we get something wrong here? Oh, my bad. I need to put that inside of the spec. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so I'll delete the pod and we'll just try to recreate it and see if it works this time. Okay, so that's what I was expecting to happen before, where now it ran that rule and it's basically telling it that, because I changed this to enforce, I'm not able to, edit or apply that YAML, and it's rejected through admission control. One other quick thing I want to show is, if you recall, the policy that we started with was just at the pod level, but Kyverno has this feature where it can automatically now also, based on because this is a policy written at the pod level, it will generate policies for common pod controllers automatically. And you can control that. There's a feature for this autogen validation rule. You can control that and specify which pod controllers you want. But by default, we do it for daemon sets, deployments, jobs, and stateful sets. So the nice thing here is now if a user just creates a deployment which has a pod template spec which doesn't match, it will get rejected at that level. You don't have to wait till the pod actually is running and deployed, because those things are hard to debug then, right? Because they would show up in just the events. So
is that extensible, or does that only apply to built-in pod generating types?
So right now, the feature is for pod controllers built in, but we do have some thoughts on how to make it extensible just for anything that works with owner references, right? Mm-hmm. So the basic idea is if you have an owner reference and some other controller managing that resource, you would be able to apply the policy at the owner level versus the managed resource. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's one feature which had sort of come up also from users, because a common problem with policies is otherwise if they're written at the, so ideally you want to create policies at the pod level, but then you want to apply them at the controller level and reject at that, right? So this kind of gives you the best of both. Let me see if there's any other quick features I want to highlight, right? So there's, we talked about the admission controller. This is the autogen feature that I was just mentioning. That you could apply policies at the controller level, and you can control this, in fine grained, like if you want to specify which particular, resources you want. And there's also, several of these, I showed this on the repo as well, right? So we have several best practice policies. Whoops, I think that stopped my share somehow. We have several best practice policies inside of the Kyverno repo. Let me go back to that. And the idea here was, I think there's also a similar effort with OPA Gatekeeper, but to make sure that, things which are covered, like for example, in a pod, in PSPs can be also covered through Kyverno, and we can, sort of extend it. This is, everything's customizable. So for example, if you want to, write your own similar policies like that, those could be done as well. Any other thoughts or questions?
So I was going to ask Tim, I don't know if it was last meeting, but you had started discussing the profiles approach to the next iteration on PSP. Jim, are you aware of that effort? Because I would like to kind of see both your feedback as well as just like the implementation of those policies, or profiles, not policies.
No, I'm not.
I can. I'll send you the document on Slack.
Okay.
After. It should also be on our agenda if you look down like a week or two.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go check that out.
I had another. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. All I was going to ask is like, I've had this general concern with things like Rego and this as well. Like, how do you, like, do you guys have thoughts or tooling around like making sure when someone writes a policy that it actually does what they think it
What?
does?
No, yeah, good question, right? And so we are, that was one of the reasons why we are focusing now on creating, so two things. One is validating the policy, like we just saw in what I did. I had the attribute in the wrong place, so that should have been caught through a validation rule. And the second part is, how do I test the policy without applying it, right? So for that, we are creating a CLI where you could just have a policy which you're developing, but then you would test it on a cluster through your kubectl, and it would show you the violations or what the results of that policy would be before you put that before you activate it in your cluster.
Hey, this is Rita. For the Rego stuff, we encourage developers to create unit tests that properly test the Rego logic to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. And we also have tests in E2E to make sure Gatekeeper is doing what it's supposed to do, whereby we make sure the resources get a deny when certain policies are installed in the cluster. And then the last piece is also around, we added the dry run feature to basically allow cluster admins to test their policies in a cluster with existing resources before they actually roll it out and start enforcing. Hope that helps.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
All those things I think add up to a lot of protection. So thank you.
I was curious how you resolve conflicts in mutation.
So where, like what would be an example of a conflict where if there's multiple rules?
Yeah, I mean, if you had one just to give a stupid example, like if you had one policy that says the images must be tagged with latest, and another policy that says replace all image tags with v1.
Right. Yeah. So again, those type of things would need to be tested, right? Kyverno by itself would not sort of be able to resolve that. It would just apply.
Yeah, you're about to answer what I was going to ask.
Sorry. Yeah, so it would apply those policies as you've kind of defined them. So if you have rules and orders, so between two policies, we don't do any ordering, but if there is rules within a policy, those are applied in order, and then the final result is then sent back to the admission controller, to the API server. So yeah, if there's any thoughts on what we could do to avoid those type of conflicts or situations, would love to hear more, but yeah, not sure if there's something that can be checked up front in terms of those, just resolving the policy, like the results of the policy.
So I think we should do a quick time check. If you can, maybe we can carry this conversation forward offline and get through a policy working group, Git Repo and multi-tenancy quickly, so we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grab Rita before we run out of time.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, so definitely just switching to the Git repo request, right? So this is from the policy working group. And, I can pull up the request itself, but what we were looking for was, just a place for like proposals and other things to other artifacts for collaboration. And I've submitted this request in, under Kubernetes org. And I think this is following, there was a prior template and some precedents. So what this is awaiting is just if there's any thoughts on or questions or other things we need to add to this request. And we have the approvals, of course, from the working group. I had also sent emails on the mailing list.
Yeah, so you definitely did the right thing. And at this point, we should probably discuss on the mailing list.
Okay.
And get some feedback from the TLs here. Nothing sounds terribly off about this, but
so I don't think it was this issue, but maybe it was. But wasn't there some? I felt like I read something saying that as a rule, working groups are not allowed to own repos.
I mean, other working groups, we have a working group multi-tenancy repo. This doesn't feel different. That's a working group of SIG Auth.
No, I think the rule doesn't make sense. Like,
well, SIG Auth still owns the code, so SIG Auth is ultimately responsible for anything in those repos.
Yeah, it's mostly a matter of like if stuff atrophies and rots, like who's responsible for moving it out and cleaning it up, or if, especially when it gets to code, right? Like if something is, I mean, if it's alpha level, like big disclaimers, this is not production, don't use it in production, it's a little easier. But if there's issues found or something has a dependency that has a vulnerability, like GitHub starts sending notifications about vulnerable dependencies and those get routed to whoever owns the repo. So it's mostly questions about like who is responsible for it, especially if it's sort of experimental types of things that are gonna, some might grow and proceed, some might not, and the ones that don't, like who decides when to delete them, or do they just sit here and live forever? Those are the most of the questions I have.
Along those lines, I'd be interested in encoding that in the repo name somehow, like WG policy prototypes or experimental.
Yeah, or multi-tenancy, at least we instructed multi-tenancy to be a little bit crisper about the fact that this was prototypes. I mean, I think a key point here is that code in those repos is not part of Kube, in the sense of there is no project in there that can be called part of Kube. It has to move out into a SIG sponsored repo through this SIG or through another SIG that is the policy working group reports into. So like to move it to the next step, like it's something that's recommended for people to use in a real way, is the SIG has to bless that and then take ownership of the code.
That's especially important for code because you don't want people depending on code that's nested inside one folder of a repo and along with other prototypes that you don't have a good coherent way to version independently. So before, basically the point where you would want anyone to actually depend on the code, it needs to be in its own thing so you can version it.
Yeah, so happy to, again, if there's suggestions of the name, etc., we could add add some more details to the name. And then what, so with the multi-tenancy working group, I know the leads and for the working group have been pretty much responsible for managing. So there's 3 projects right now which are contributing into that repo, and they've been sort of doing the any governance of that repo itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just let me know what's required and if there's anything else I need to add either to this request or to the mailing list. And I think from the procedure perspective, once everybody's ready or somebody would need to then approve on this request, and that would move it into the next stage of the repo creation, etc.
Yeah, so let's, thanks for making us all aware of it. It looks like we haven't had any activity on it, so let's let it sit for another 2 weeks. But this announcement is helpful to get the visibility. But yeah, let's carry the discussion forward on the mailing list.
Okay. All right, so then the last item that I wanted to also cover is, it's a multi-tenancy project. It's one of the 3 projects that I mentioned. So you're just looking for feedback and thoughts on this, and I've had conversations. Tim also connected me to Rory, where we have had conversations of how this may fit in with some ongoing, CIS benchmarks types of efforts. So the idea here was there's different ways, just like we were discussing with policies, seems like there's different ways to achieve multi-tenancy or various levels of multi-tenancy within clusters. And what was missing, and a common request that was coming up in the working group, was how do I know if I have achieved multi-tenancy, or what's adequate and what's not, right? So the idea here was to try and measure a running cluster, and to be able to report whether it was configured for some level of multi-tenancy or some adequate with the adequate security constructs, and to be able to report that. So what we have so far defined, which is in the working group repo, is about 7 different categories of where we would do validation checks. And there's 3 profile levels that we're proposing and 2 types of tests that we would run. So the idea here would be to come up with a test tool, like a E2E test tool, as well as some guidelines for how folks could configure their clusters for multi-tenancy.
So we are running pretty short on time.
Yeah.
I suggest that we treat this one as an announcement and potentially hoist it up to the next agenda so that we can do 5 minutes or more, and eventually get to some most stuff real quickly.
Okay. All right. So I'll add links to the Git repo for this as well. And there's a document with all of the tests that we have so far. So feel free, again, if there's any comments or feedback, we could do that. And then, carry on the discussion perhaps in an upcoming meeting.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. We love those. That's super cool.
All right.
So Rita, do you want to present, or should I just?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to present, but just want to get everybody's thoughts around how do we define maturity level on sub-projects. And I think, I'm just thinking like CNCF has a maturity model. I wonder if we should follow that, or is there another process that we should follow?
To be honest, the secret driver is the trial run for us. I'm not sure if there are recommendations that we inherited from the SIG architecture base charter, but I would have to check. Jordan, do you know from your
yeah, I'm trying to think about the different dimensions we have. So most of the sub-projects we have today, maybe all of them, are things that live like in tree in the Kubernetes project. And so they either have APIs associated with them, or they have like feature flags associated with them that have gone through sort of an alpha, beta, GA lifecycle. Something that lives out of tree may have an API associated, but obviously isn't paired to the Kubernetes release. But I would expect similar levels of maturity. So alpha level basically means release to release, you might have to delete and recreate everything. It's not claimed to be production ready. Once you get to beta level, it is expected to not have like known crasher bugs, and is generally expected to have a path to GA that is understood and planned. And then once it reaches GA, that indicates it has been like scale tested and audited in various aspects.
Wouldn't we? I was kind of thinking about like DNS as an example where we define the spec. I would kind of and like different SIGs have done this slightly differently, but anything that we would consider like an official sub-project, certainly the spec part of it, having it in a place that SIG Auth owns to at least scope it and bound it would probably be a good idea. Whether that's the enhancements repo or something a little bit more more of an artifact like the DNS spec was.
So Rita had asked me this, and I'd asked her to put it on the agenda. Like, I was wondering, since at least the CSI driver does have an API, would it make sense to do like a retroactive KEP for what exists today, merge that into enhancements, and then define the alpha, beta, GA graduation?
And that would be amazing because it doesn't require anything novel. Is there any challenge with that? Like, is it like reading concerns there?
Yeah, so I just linked the graduation criteria doc from CNCF. Now that's at the project level, right? So sandbox, incubating, and graduation. I don't know how relevant that is for a sub project, but I think that is a little bit different from, let's say, where the APIs are at, right? So I just want to bring that up as we've been talking about APIs, but there's like this stage for the project at large, right?
Yeah, because Kubernetes is graduated, and one of the characteristics of that is that there's the process and all that. I mean, certainly I know when we've talked about this historically, and I don't know if we've subtly altered it since then, but we've usually said the Kubernetes process controls everything. And so we can look to that as like, Sandbox is actually a good example for working groups right now. To get into incubating, you have to be owned by a SIG. And then incubating is effectively anything that hasn't gone GA. And then once it reaches GA, it's GA under the guidance of the Kubernetes project for most other things that we've done. Like, it has to follow the same deprecation policies. So that's maybe another variation we could consider. Yeah, so I'm wondering maybe for the Secret Store CSI driver project, maybe we can follow the same KEP process to get the project into sandbox stage, perhaps. We can totally start that work. I just want to make sure does that align with everybody's, do you think that's a good path forward?
I mean, I think the KEP process is flexible enough that it can accommodate a wide variety of types of designs. We've used it for everything from technical designs to like release process changes to documentation process changes. I think it's a place that most people are already looking at on a regular basis. So putting it there is going to funnel it into the right people's workflows to, have to see that it's there and see it's under SIG Auth and see what the status is. Like, whether we call these subprojects like sandbox and like use the CNCF terminology, I'm not sure how much sense that makes, but to the degree it makes sense, we can use those terms, I guess.
Yeah, I was mostly referencing it. Like, I think the stages match pretty well to how we think about code moving into a formal process. I would probably say that this is already in the incubating. The KEP that defines the current state could be what we consider as the pathway to being GA.
Okay, so what would you recommend for next step?
I mean, if what we've done for other things that we kind of had existing designs for was just a first pass of getting that sort of into the KEP folder under SIG Auth, roughly copy pasting existing designs and decisions into sort of a retroactive document just to capture the current state. That kind of puts it in the right place and gives people who are interested in finding out what the current state is a place to look, and then merge that and then iterate on any additional yet to be resolved issues and sort of fill those out. Oh yeah.
Okay, so just to clarify, I just copy pasted the link for SIG Auth. That's the one you're referring to, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Be a doc under there, and yeah, I'll try to find a couple examples where we did this with other features.
Awesome.
All right. Well, we have one more minute. I don't think we're going to get to the.
Let's just push everything off into next week. That's fine, or not next meeting, not next week.
That sounds good. Thank you. We can also loop back in the Slack channel if we want spillover discussion. But all my meetings are running over. Now I'm working from home because there's nobody waiting outside the meeting room knocking on the door as soon as I go for all right. Thank you, everybody. This concludes our SIG Auth meeting. I'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again for the
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.
You too.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.